Welcome, welcome. My name is Allison Druin, and I am a professor in the iSchool at the University of Maryland, as well as chief futurist in the Division of Research at the University of Maryland. Joined at the hip with me is my co-director, Ira Chenoy, who happens to be the Associate Dean of the Philip Merrill College of Journalism at the University of Maryland. The Future of Information Alliance was launched here at the University of Maryland in 2011 to be a catalyst for interdisciplinary collaboration, discussion, research, and action on important issues related to the evolving role of information in our lives. In addition to broad engagement on campus and key support from the R.W. Deutsch Foundation and university leadership, we have 10 founding partners from leading cultural organizations and government institutions. They are represented on the panel we have assembled today, and you will hear more about them shortly.
So today's program wraps up a week of programs focused on what we've been calling the future of the past, which at its heart actually grew out of the interests of our partners and explores this paradox of our time, that in the midst of this information explosion, we are actually in danger of losing important parts of our cultural heritage for one reason or another, resources or the difficulties in archiving what's going on today. Through these events, I think we've had something like a total of about 500 people show up at events large and small. I'm going to tell you a little bit about them. So on Monday, we had a program at Fort McHenry hosted by the Park Service. They're right here. And this was a discussion about how to keep the past preserved and alive for future generations, especially in an era of declining resources. It was a fun program that involved kids at one point too, and a flag folding ceremony, and it was great. That program explored the value of both place-based learning and virtual tools for engaging students with history. Wednesday's program was a special broadcast of the Kojo Nnamdi show from the National Geographic Auditorium. We have Brendan here somewhere, Brendan in the back, producer. And the first hour of this focused on the future of exploration. We had some wonderful modern-day explorers who do things like do archaeology from using satellites and robotics to go undersea. It was wonderful. And in the second hour, we had the Secretary of the Smithsonian and two marvelous scientists and researchers from the Smithsonian who talked, among other things, about 3D scanning, imaging, and printing. And we had a group of students there, great group from the Barry School. We have a Barry School in the back, who asked just the best questions of the day. We're very interested in 3D printing. A lot of questions about 3D printing. And then yesterday, we were at the Newseum. Paul Sparrow was here, who hosted us there, and we explored both the challenges and the possibilities in archiving and searching audio files, how to solve the puzzle of archiving a social movement, particularly the Occupy movement. Howard Besser was here and talked about that, and you'll hear more from him today. And the larger issues associated with how search engines of the future will function or will need to function to deal with the problem of the surprising fragility of important streams of information in the midst of this information explosion. And our good friend Dan Russell, who you'll hear more about in a minute, was part of that program and has been with us all week, actually.
Now, while there were 500 or more people in person with us this week, we've had hundreds and hundreds of people on the live stream. We welcome those of you that are on the live stream today. This will be archived among all of our programs throughout the week, and you'll be able to come back to it again and again to hear not just Ira and I talk, but all of our amazing futurists. We have titled today for today's program, Toward an Agenda of Research and Action, a discussion with FIA partners. As the concluding event of the week, representatives of our partners are here, and they will be, all of these chairs will be filled up with our partners. And they will be talking to you about ways of enhancing the future of the past. And we're going to have a discussion. And so if you're here in the audience here, or if you're here in the audience out there, tweet it, post it, or come up and let us know. We'll be giving you a mic, and we'll be having a wonderful discussion. But before we get to the folks who are here with us today, we want to invite up Patricia Steele, the Dean of the University of Maryland Libraries. Pat has been a terrific friend and supporter of FIA. In fact, we have located our offices here because we love the library so much here this fall, and she has been a visionary leader bringing new life and new ways of making libraries relevant to our campus community. She will be retiring in a few months from now. Yes, I know. But she has also put in place a great team of administrators who are, some of them are here, wave, yes, you're here, yay, and who will continue on with this work. And so please join me in welcoming Pat Steele.
Okay, they told me I could come up after they said nice things, so I think they've said nice things, so I can come up. So, welcome. I really appreciate being given this opportunity to welcome you this morning to the libraries. I do think it's been a terrific week, as you see already, and this will be a wonderful conclusion, anticipating a lot of conversation. We are the appropriate place, I think, for this conversation to take place, to work on that FIA action agenda. For a number of reasons, as Allison said, our now announced first chief futurist, which was who else has that kind of title? I mean, this is like Dan is a user happiness, which I still want somebody on a team that's a user happiness person. But the futurist is a good one too. So, and her offices are down on our 4th floor, and that will be our research commons. So there'll be very good synergy with that over time. But more importantly, the libraries are really pretty deeply involved in defining our future in terms of people's view of us in the past. And I'll give you an example, and a couple of you have heard this story, but there was an event in this room some weeks ago, and I was sitting in my office 2 doors down, and 2 professors came out of the meeting, and one of them said very loudly to the other, "Look around, because this is going to be gone." And I thought, whoa, I don't want to hear that in my office, so I came bolting out, saying, now wait a minute, you can't say things like that in front of the Dean of Libraries, you know. But what is the word what do I tell them about what our future is? Because they connect our past books, and that's where you get information, with the library, and they do not see that the future that we're trying to define, and that means a lot of education, a lot of thinking, and a lot of work on our part to make that transition and make it clear to them and start demonstrating it. So this week, pardon me, we've had a couple of events here and off campus that give you an example of the intense conversations going on within libraries about what's the future. One of them was a workshop down at the Association of Research Libraries had, a day-long workshop trying to lay out what is that future. We had a speaker here from Ithaca Strategic and Consulting Services talking to us about the future. So we're all talk about the, what's the future. So we're in good company, I think, as we think about the disruption of our information world, and I think the corresponding promise and excitement for it, because we in the libraries are really excited about the things that we can start taking on and educating our users about being able to provide for them as their world has shifted dramatically. So I feel like we're all on a fast track to somewhere to be determined, and maybe this conversation today will help us a little bit. So welcome, and thank you for coming to the libraries.
Great.
We have a printer downstairs if you want to play with it.
She's got 3D printers for you all. Okay, all right. Thank you so much, Pat. Now, in a moment, we're going to be passing over the program to a great friend of the FIA. He is not only our moderator, Dan Russell, but he began the week moderating our program on Monday, and having spoken yesterday about his work at Google on the Newseum program, where he's also known as the Director of User Happiness. Here at Maryland, we have given him a title, and he is the Maryland's first, and perhaps the world's first, futurist in residence. And he is also one of our founding partners here in brain trust and thought leader when it comes to the future of information. Dan, a few years ago, was our very first futurist to come and speak to us all. Now, but before we bring Dan up, and I know you're all waiting for that, we wanted to share with you a video that briefly summarizes the last few days that we've all shared together with many of the futurists that have shared their ideas. It is a video that we put together between our FIA team, but really led by our designer, our FIA designer, Jane Gould, who's in the back. Thank you, Jane. Oh my goodness, she's a hero. Woo! But all of the this though gives me an opportunity though to thank all of the tech teams throughout the week. You have no idea how none of this would be possible. These people were not only live streaming, live broadcasting, but archiving and handing us video as we're walking out of doors. I mean, amazing, amazing people. So with that, are you ready to, there you go. Okay, I'm just vamping here, folks. With that, I'm going to pass to you now the Future of Information Alliance, the last few days.
Today we're exploring the future of the past.
So as I was preparing for this presentation, I began to think about what we do in Baltimore City Schools and realized that educators are the ultimate futurists. We deal in the business of making sure that our kids are given the resources that they need to be ready for a future that is yet unknown.
The reality is that we're in a kind of unique field, archaeology. I think it's one of the few professions where our entire goal is to make our textbooks go out of date.
I call archaeology the gateway drug to science.
So, you know, the future of exploration is a lot of going out and trying to make the unknown unknowns into known unknowns, and, you know, then we have something actually that we might know about if we don't know about it now, and maybe we'll know about it.
Digitizing the entire Smithsonian collection would take 260 years, and that's at a rate of 1 object per second, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
The fossils themselves, which is part of the patrimony of another country, we can share those and archive them online. And I like to say there's dissertations worth of studies to be done on these digital data sets.
If we 3D print out that supernova, you can hold the death of a star, which is a supernova, in the palm of your hands.
About the orchid, you may not know, but over half the orchids in the United States are endangered because of habitat destruction and destruction of the pollinators. And so some of the work we're doing in 3D is simply preserving these orchids before they disappear.
Finding objects in the world out there and bringing them in. 3D is I think, one of the potential solutions for making the museum's walls transparent. That's a big issue.
They had so many fish when they came out, about 5,000 or so, they felt they could not identify them all. So they put them up on Facebook, and scientists all over the world provided the metadata for all those fish. And so I think what you'll find is more and more crowdsourcing in and around a lot of these things.
On Flickr, which is a photography site, you have 20 million photos being viewed every 60 seconds. On Twitter, you have 278,000 tweets. And these are average numbers, but in 60 seconds, 278,000 tweets. How do you keep track of that? How do you archive that? How do you figure out which of those 278,000 tweets are relevant and which are not? Instagram, which is really based almost entirely on mobile phones, you're having 36,000 photos are uploaded every 60 seconds. And on Tumblr, which is a blogging format, you have 70,000 new photos being posted every 60 seconds.
We are in an era of exploding amounts of information. And what will not work and what will not scale to this is to have the archive that is gathering all of that together provide the indexing and the metadata. Right, it has to happen somewhere else. You need a combination of intelligent extraction tools and getting it from the creators themselves, and automatic things like GPS. There are lots of things that you can streamline automatically, but people have to turn those on, and the services have to collect them and not throw them out.
So are there any?
It's true we're downloading 100 hours of YouTube every minute, but there's more. Some estimates put it at 1.5 tera words a day. Think about what that means in terms of what we're trying to do as archivists, what we're trying to do as historians, as literators. So we're in an interesting world where data is not a static thing anymore. And one of the things we do is not just take the object itself, and I'm going to focus here on Van Gogh's self-portrait, but look what we can do by the scan operation. We can zoom in and zoom in again. That kind of representation gets you closer to the reality of that object and the very shape of the blobs, of the paint, and the brush strokes in intimate detail in a way that you can't do. They won't let you get that.
Proud black man with the 54th Regiment, front line fighting for my rights against Confederates. Once was a slave, but I'ma be a veteran, and if I die in line, at least y'all get to see my legend. And try to make us weak and strip the shoes off our feet, but we won't see defeat, cause we trying to be free. Freedom at last, yep, freedom at last. As Carney stands tall with the flag still on his back, you dig?
They keep fighting, yeah, they keep fighting, treating like
And now I truly am passing this to Dan Russell. Thank you, Dan.
Great, thank you. Yeah. So I'd like to invite all of the panelists to come up and join me on stage. So that means you and you and you, and actually about half the audience should come up here. So I'm really happy to be here today, and I'm going to be moderating this discussion, this panel conversation, really. And the model I have in mind is not so much that we're going to be here going one at a time, person by person. Basically, you're going to be at the end of the stick. We're not going to do that. This is going to be the Paris Salon of 1920. And I guess that makes me Gertrude Stein, but you know, you do what you can. So let me first introduce each person by name and affiliation, and then if you could say like 10 seconds about what it is you do, and a little bit of background, that'd be great. So first here we have Paul Sparrow from the Newseum, and you're the broadcasting senior vice president. That's your title. So tell us about what you do.
I work with all of our interactive media. I developed all of the websites and our social medias, and developed the interactive exhibits within the Newseum.
Great. And next to him is Barbara Ferry from the she was the director of library and archives at the National Geographic Society.
Okay, well, I have the best job in the world. I get to work with researchers, explorers, writers, photographers who contribute to the National Geographic mission, whether through our magazine or through our scientific endeavors. And my role is to provide the resources that they need, similar to McKeldin Library here, for them to do top-notch research and background research. And also we are the sort of the keepers of the records and archives of National Geographic, which is an excellent job in itself.
And next to Barbara is George Coulbourne, the Executive Program Officer, Office of Strategic Initiatives in the Library of Congress. Tell us what you do, George.
All right, Dan. I lead currently the National Digital Stewardship Residency Program, which was just launched this year to embed students and residents in real workplace situations to develop technology in the various areas, especially that they've selected, as well as a national outreach program and digital preservation training for the novice.
Great. Next to him is Brendan Sweeney, the managing producer of the Kojo Namde Show at WAMU 88.5. Brendan, what is it you do?
Well, I manage the day-to-day operations of a daily talk show on the NPR station here in Washington. And I guess that on a certain level, what we do is we get really geeked about all the awesome work that our partners here are doing, and we play the role of curator and figure out how to provide a platform for telling those very interesting stories.
Very good, very good. Next to Brendan is Don Kodak, the director of U.S. National Park Service Center for Media Services. What does that involve?
Well, I get to manage a center that creates interpretive educational media for the National Park Service. We've been doing that for over 40 years and telling stories in place in parks. And if you've ever been to a park, a national park, you've seen the work that we do.
Great. Next to him is Tim Schaefer, the Director of Technology and Sustainability for the Berry School. Tell us a little bit about what you do.
I think most school people can relate. It's hard to summarize what I do in 10 seconds because there are so many parts. The technology part of my job is both supporting the institution from an operational perspective and teaching and learning, making sure that students and teachers have what they need technology-wise, but also thinking about what we need to be doing, which relates to our conversations this week in terms of technology. And then also I do have the sustainability piece, which is operationally how we as a school think about sustainability and how we incorporate it into our curriculum.
Okay. Next to Tim is Barney Krukhoff, the Geographic Information Officer in the Office of the Governor of Maryland. What does that entail?
It entails helping agencies manage spatial data that they may be creating on land use or economic development, on environment, giving them the right tools, right policies, and helping curate the data. And if we have data that we can make public, making it public.
Very good, very good. And next to Barney is our guest from yesterday's Newseum program, Howard Besser from NYU, who was a pioneer, it says here, of digital archiving, who was in yesterday's program. Tell us a little bit about what you do at NYU.
Yeah, I direct a master's degree program titled Moving Image Archiving and Preservation. But in general, I'm trying to teach a new generation of digital archivists of all types of material. I do that both with our own students and with professionals in various cultural heritage organizations.
Right. And so as you see, we have a great panel, people who care deeply about stuff in the world, for access, for students, for growth, for understanding, for research and scholarship. So in the spirit of trying to reach out to more and more people, I want to let you know that what we're doing is making this, as Ira and Allison said, available to social media. So if you'd like to tweet about this, we have two hashtags. Hash FIA UMD, and second hashtag is hash future of the past. Case does not matter. Or does it? No. It's an interesting question. Thinking about archiving a case. Of course, you can also join in via Google by going to the Future of Information Alliance community on Google+. Okay? So we also have 3x5 cards for people who are physically co-present. So we've got 3x5 cards, and we'll have both Ira and Allison with the microphones wandering around when we get to the question answering part of this. As you see by the chair on the far right of the stage, we have a special guest who may or may not appear. Kind of a Schrodinger guest. So the point of today is really that we want to wrap up this whole week by identifying elements of a research program and a set of action plans that we can engage in going forward. So I want to think about it this way. Visions of the future profoundly influence current research, from the inspirational role of science fiction to narratives about development and progress, to utopian as well as dystopian predictions about the impact of technology on society. The tomorrows we work towards, consciously or unconsciously, can significantly shape what counts as an important contribution in today's research. However, despite their importance, we have relatively limited discussion about these things in general, about the details of what our futures in this area will entail. So that's why we're here today. We want to have that conversation now. We have this fantastic panel of experts that will help us do this. So we want to address things like what's going to stay the same, what's going to change. And for our discussion today, I'm looking for visionary calls, critical reflections, and even prophetic warnings of dire doom. So let me start off this discussion by asking, how does this stuff matter? In an era of tightening and declining resources, one could ask, why should we bother to preserve this stuff when there are so many other demands for our resources? Now, we know that archives are mostly untouched by the vast majority of people, but we also believe the archive is valuable. Are we using our resources wisely and efficiently? So, as I said before, since we have so many speakers, one of the things we're going to do is adopt two conventions. A, we're not going to go round robin, because that will be killer for the people on the far right. Howard, you're brilliant, you're inventive, but Paul's brilliant and inventive too, and so they will leach out all the beautiful content of a question by the time it gets down there. So let's have this one-on-one conversation, like I said, like the salon model. So Howard, would you pass the wine down, please? So if you have something to say, very good.
Can I turn the water into wine?
If you can do that, we will cede the rest of the conversation to you. So we're going to do this not as a round robin, but more in the salons tradition. And the second thing, since this is the age of tweets, and we're not in the age of Jane Austen, keep your comments kind of pointed, short, punchy, insightful, brilliant, and creative. Okay, you got all that? Okay. So we're going to do this. Now, let me start off by asking a question. So whoever has a comment, just jump in and raise your hand or something. First question. Who are the users of our archives? What kinds of things are they doing? And what can we do to improve their uses of this material in the future? Any comments, thoughts? I'm going to call on people. Well, Barbara, I know you've got a very particular user population.
They're the creators. They're the thinkers. They're not looking at archives because they're dead. They're looking at archives because they're alive with ideas of what their research might, the results of their research might blossom. Right. So we never have somebody coming to our archives who's looking for something that won't be interesting. Right. We have people looking for ways in which to look at the past and understand the present in more detail.
And your user population is?
Oh, well, my user population, we have our internal staff, so we have 1,500 staff at National Geographic. And
but they're capture staff. I mean, it's not open to the public.
It's not open to the public, although we do open our archives occasionally to researchers, to scholars who are doing research in areas of geography, history, or history of organizations that have studied geography or media or photography. We've definitely done that in the past. So those coming to our archives, especially internally, are looking to see the impact that that our researchers and our writers and our scientists have what the impact of that has been on the present and in the future.
Let me ask you, Tim. I'll get to you in a second. So Tim, you've got a population of students that have to engage with archival materials at some point. They have to write original materials and so on. How do they get access to the content?
Well, I think that's the exciting piece of what we've been talking about, is the fact that the access is changing, right? So while I felt great nostalgia walking through the stacks and really like stacks, on Wednesday the Smithsonian talked about their online library of 3D materials, of digitized resources, Google scanning and primary documents. So that's changing, the ease of access to that, which is really broadening, I think, the group that can make use of the archives.
Right. So Don, you had a thought?
Yeah, I think that our interest in archives is, and not necessarily in the archives that we, the National Park Service, maintain, but the archives that are being maintained throughout the culture, is that, from where we stand today, we don't know what's going to be important in the future. We don't know what piece of the heritage of this country is going to need to be told by the National Park Service or by some agent like the Park Service. And so we count on the archives, or people archiving and saving everything, because we don't know what we don't know.
Paraphrase.
Yeah, continuing off of that, one of the things history has taught us is that the decisions that were made about what to keep and what not to keep early on, we have second thoughts about what those decisions were. For example, I deal a lot with film archives that rejected home movies because those are inappropriate. Now they embrace home movies because they're the kind of the truest tellers of tales of the times and of normal everyday habits. So I think, knowing who, we can't really know what people will want in the future. Then just to comment on what Barbara said earlier, I think that our archives, our users, I think she's right about the users being creators, but the creators of the future are everyone. It is not. We are in an era. We are no longer in an era where there are only professional creators. Everyone is a creator.
That's right. Although people often comment that we live in kind of a time when we're dumbing down the culture. In fact, as I said at the Newseum yesterday, we're producing so many words and so much text that it's a really different time. Do you have something?
I just wanted to follow up what Howard said and say, it's not just that everybody's a creator, everyone is an archivist. So I don't consider myself an archivist, so when this question was coming down, I said, what am I going to say? But I'm struggling to keep the current map current. And, but that really implies some responsibility, I think, to save it on occasion. And we all have to think of ourselves as archivists a little bit.
To take this in a slightly different direction, Newseum is a relatively new organization, and what we have is almost a perishable public archive, in that every day we publish front pages from all over the world. Just the front page in little JPEGs. You can link through to the website or everything, but every day we put them up for 24 hours, and then they go away. And then tomorrow's papers come up. Now, if they have a big news day like we have today, which is honoring the death of Nelson Mandela, we will archive those pages and make them available to the public on the website. But many, many days we don't archive them. They get put onto CDs and stored as optical, storage, and that if someone wants to come back and get them, we can pull them out. But it's a perishable, very digital sort of what's today's happening. And I think that reflects a lot of what's going on, and what our challenges we talked about yesterday is that how do you preserve the digital present, because it is overwhelming and it is so perishable.
You bring up an excellent point about the perishability, and Brendan, I'm thinking about your job, where in some sense radio, the spoken word, is immensely perishable. If you're 2 milliseconds late, you missed it, right? And yet you managed to archive, and I know when I've been on the show, you give me a CD when I walk out,
right?
Which is a lovely, quaint gesture.
Yes, exactly. We don't do that anymore. We moved facilities. We don't have CD burning.
Yeah, right. It's like a handwritten URL.
Yeah, right, exactly.
It's sort of anachronistic. But how do you deal with this sort of perishability of material and content?
Well, I mean, I think that WAMU, on the one hand, we have a archive, but we're not talking about it being on the scale of National Geographic. I mean, we produce, a couple hours of content every day, which does turn into a lot. But I mean, it's sort of simultaneously incredibly frustrating, the idea that there's magic lurking within these MP3s that are created. I know you guys talked about that yesterday, and the idea that there are elements of, there's turns of phrase, or we talked to a famous person, we talked to a 95-year-old Sephardic Jewish musician yesterday, and she gave us all these just amazing sort of little pieces of history that, from archiving perspective, would be useful in perpetuity. But I don't know if any of the mechanisms we have right now are creating signals to people who who aren't core listeners to the Kojo Nnamdi Show or WAMU, that this grand insight lurks somewhere in this MP3 that's streaming at kojoshow.org. So, I mean, on a certain level, I feel sort of disempowered by the tools that we currently have, just as somebody who creates stuff in real time every single day. But the flip side of it that I was thinking about as you were talking about this is we have lots of different archives, but I think that from our piece, storytelling is so important. And the reason why each of these different archives are so important is the ability that we have to take these raw materials and turn them into stories is so important. And so I don't know if the sort of metrics that we have for following how many people come on and log on and do all this other stuff are actually capturing the extent to which those connections are being made.
Right. So one of the things that I'm hearing you say is reflecting a little bit on what Anne had said yesterday about, could we search inside the sound archive, right?
Right.
And one of the nice things that you can see starting to come up is the rise of speaker identification. So Kojo's voice, very easy to pick out. And can I write a piece of code, an algorithm that will actually identify every instance in that hour-long segment, from 16 seconds to 18 seconds. It's Kojo commenting on this versus the guest or something. And so what I would challenge the future of archive analysis is, can I detect Rich Little imitating Richard Nixon? Right?
Right.
Once you can do that level of speaker ID, we are in a different world. You are no longer the creator of ephemera that's uninspectable. You are now a creator of something that's searchable. And that's sort of the trend you see. As I mentioned yesterday at the Newseum, we're seeing this increasing competence and capability at doing datafication. That's the password for taking signal and then finding elements in it that you can search for. So we see this kind of stuff happening increasingly.
But part of my remit also doing a local show is to provide some sort of representation of what's important to the community that listens to WAMU, to reflect the unique local identity of this region. And so I wonder if those cultural nuances are so minute that it would be too frustrating to try to write a code that was specific to that. Like understanding Washington, D.C. and the weird things that set off a D.C. native or somebody in Prince George's County and why they get angry when you call it PG County. I don't know how you're ever going to write a code that can do that or that can pick up those little elements. So.
That's a good point.
The code is a librarian. It's a human being who can make those interpretations. So somehow we have to create an interface, I think, between the automation and the people who are contributing to it. I think we brought that up yesterday when we were thinking, how can we put the keywords into something as you're going along, as it's being created, and so it may be a professional or maybe the people who are actually creating the content. I think that has to be built into the system and into the process. And we're struggling with that now ourselves, and we're creating solutions as we're creating content. How can we put those in so we don't have to wait until the script and the script is added into the system to be searched?
Have a comment, Don?
Yeah, I think just to play off of the datification comment that you made, and how you have these scripts and you have these audio archives. But the datification, in the Park Service, we talk a lot about the untold stories that exist in the fabric of the culture of this country. And one of the things that as I read, I find that that big data sets that we're able to amass, one of the things that it's bringing to the fore is that when we get enough distance away and we start to see patterns in this data set, that some of those untold stories unexpectedly start to emerge. And so there, some of the undercurrent that really hasn't been verbalized or hasn't been tangibly visible actually becomes visible. And so that's why the bigger the data set, the more archives we have, the more future people are going to be able to know about us.
Right. So George, if I take what I hear Barbara and Don and other people saying, we're changing the cost of access. You've got a ton of stuff at the Library of Congress. And we're living in this age where more stuff is pouring in rapidly, right? You're big, but you can't handle all of that. How do you make those choices?
Well, that's a challenge, and I think that's a challenge that the area within the Library of Congress, Library Services, is looking at now. And I know that 4 of the residents that we just placed are looking at how to improve search, because it's like Barbara said, I mean, you're saving, you're archiving, but how do you find it later? I mean, you're putting it on a disk. So I think that's the big challenge that we're looking at now, is how do we make that determination what to save. I think a large part of our collections come in from copyright based on the deposit requirements of copyrighted materials. But clearly, we don't even keep all of that. We probably keep 40 to 50% would be about right.
And how do you choose what the bad 50% is?
Well, I mean, it's published works.
Oh, okay, so it's available elsewhere.
Yes. So we keep that, and then also what we're looking at doing, and I think that's the big challenge that we face now, is that how much longer are we going to be able to keep, because we're running out of storage. And I think other companies like Amazon and places like that have decided how to store more effectively, and perhaps, which does not involve the Dewey Decimal System.
Got it.
But again, that goes into how to search and retrieve the material. So I think there's a lot of challenges that we face. How do we continue to keep analog material? How do we find it? How do we improve what we're saving digitally? And how do we make that available?
So before you ask your question, Howard, I want to channel you. So one of the things Howard might be asking next is, but what about the ephemera? What about the home movies, right? How do you choose whether or not to include? Are you archiving all the home movies that you get?
I'm not sure. Maybe Howard can speak that at Culpeper, but I know of course we got part of the Twitter archive.
And
that was very challenging to take that. We got, there was a lot of concern from various parties. What are we going to do with the material? How are we going to make it available? So I'm not sure about YouTube and things like that at Culpeper.
No YouTube.
I don't think
it's not legal to grab the
Right.
YouTubes.
So, I mean, I just think that it's probably going to be some real sea change down the road of how we're going to address this digital ephemera, like you say, that's just inundating the country.
And it's
one of the world.
Let me ask Howard to make his comment, and then come to you, Paul.
Okay, so, but one thing that I think is very important that the Library of Congress has done is recognize about 10, 12 years ago, Library of Congress recognized that they can no longer be the only primary collector of this. And they started building alliances, first with a different program, now a program that's called National Digital Stewardship Alliance, which is an attempt to get different constituencies to come up to the plate and to say, I will be responsible for selecting the material in this area or this area. So I was part of one of the initial projects in the first round of funding, and Library of Congress came up with significant funding for this. We had a coalition from public broadcasting about saving born digital public broadcasting material. And that has turned into an entity known as the American Archive, which is in fact responsible for selecting and deciding what to collect among public broadcasting material.
Paul, you had a comment?
Well, go back to the ephemera issue. You know, there's really two different categories. There's professionally created material and there's personally created material. And the biggest change in the digital world is that in the old days, essentially everyone was the inadvertent archivist, right? Grandma's attic, right? If you did nothing, those letters were archived. They just stayed there. You had to take an active action to throw them out. So we have an archive of personal ephemera dating back to the Revolutionary War that historians can go back, and when those things are recovered, they exist. In today's world, that personal ephemera is in fact perishable. It automatically disappears unless you go to great efforts to save it. And so the inadvertent archivists of the past have now disappeared, and we're all essentially recycling our digital bits every day. So the emails, the text messages, all those things that reflect the interpersonal communications now disappear unless we take some action. And we have to find some way to take an action to preserve them.
So you're saying my old iPhone that I just tossed that actually had photos and everything on it, that's sort of like the old attic, but if that gets recycled, then
it's gone. Then you have to do something with that. In the old days, you did nothing, and it was saved.
Barney,
I just
what do you think about this, Barney?
Someone had to put it in the attic. That's all. We've all got our attics, and there's more information out there than ever. So there's more top line information being created, and there's some bottom line that'll make it to the future. And I think both are growing.
But you know, Paul's got an interesting point, because if I, for example, make a CD, I have a CD of a lot of pictures that I took on my QuickTime 1 camera, remember those? Which generated native digital PCT files. Can anybody read those now? Well, A, can you read the CD from 20 years ago? No, it's falling apart, right? You well know the problems of magnetic tapes falling apart after time. NASA has this problem in spades. They've got miles and miles and miles of tape that they can no longer read, or at best they can read once. They can't even rewind it because the particles come off as you read through the rate head. So we've got this real problem, right? Thoughts about this? What do we do?
Well, now there's probably a mathematician in the room here, and I'm not a mathematician, but it seems like you would use the quality of the sets, of large sets, right? The large data sets, and you would develop a randomized algorithm that wouldn't save everything, but would save a representative, significant amount that would statistically represent the whole set of information that's been.
Yeah, because I think.
Yeah. Isn't that what we would do? Because you can't save everything.
Yeah, well, that's what I was thinking. That the technology exists to save just about everything. You can find a machine to read everything and to transfer it, but the problem is what do you save? Because the amount of information, you can only write so many letters a day, but I probably write 100 emails a day in some days. So what do I save? And even just as a small corporate archive, just our own corporate memory, it's a big decision. What do we save and not save?
So,
and imagine that on a grand scale.
That's right. I no longer delete any email. I'm just telling you now.
But,
I don't delete
we
email.
only get 18 months of email and it's gone.
That's right. Howard.
I think that this problem of the default being that things perish unless they are reformatted, migrated, emulated, whatever, moved to different strata. The default being that things perish means that archives need to be more aggressive about collecting the material. That's number one. And number two, as I said in my talk yesterday, digital information stands a much better chance of survival if an archivist or a librarian gets involved in the creation process with either guidelines for creators on saving certain types of metadata, working with vendors or service providers, email services, to make sure that those things survive. It really, all of this requires a more aggressive act on the part of our cultural organizations to intervene in the kind of daily processes of creating and managing the digital information.
So one way to do that, I'm thinking, look at you, Barney, is that you could do crowdsourcing. So what do you do in GIS world? How do you resolve these issues?
We do try to curate Maryland's data. So we have a team of people, and we try to put the right data sets up, check back with agencies, is this up to date? We try to have a collection of data for our users that represents the best we can collect. Now, we have plenty of challenges in doing this, and we do have this Maryland State Archives where we can put a lot of our data, which we're only beginning to do, but they have the right servers, they have the right place to store it if we were to want to take it off ours. Right now, there's no real reason to take it off our server. We can afford to store it.
So the state of Maryland provides the hosting services for only internal use or external use as well. Can I get to your data?
You can get to most of it. We make it available as RESTful services, and you can view it, you can query some of it, and then there are parts that we can't share. But the majority of the state's map data is available with probably not enough instruction and enough use to make it helpful to the masses yet.
So usability counts here for a lot of this stuff, right? Mm-hmm. So Tim, let me bring you into this because Barney has brought up this issue about access and security and privacy, and this is something you have to deal with all the time with kids in your school. So I know that they must create stuff digitally, put stuff up on the school server, which is then protected from access from outside, right? How do you, as being sort of the guy in charge of the technology for a school like this, how do you work through these problems? What are the biggest issues that come up for you in sort of the security privacy issue?
Well, I think what's interesting about the question is there's some of it that really is ephemeral, that really will disappear if you don't. But rightly or wrongly, the bigger conversation in terms of schools and internet safety and all of that is about the permanence, right? All these conversations about what does it mean to apply for a job in the age of Facebook, right, versus 20 years ago where your college bad choices really were ephemeral.
Right.
So
hopefully ephemeral.
Hopefully, exactly. So I guess, I don't know if I'm answering your question. I mean, part of it I think is there is a part of it that may be disorganized, that may be chaotic, that may lack the current search tools, but the amount we can store and the automaticity of storing is continually increasing.
Well, what I'm thinking about is the kids in the 6th grade art class who do the macaroni art, and they digitize it, right?
Right.
And presumably that's private to the school. The search engines can come in and scan that stuff, right? So the question becomes, you know, in an age where I actually want to capture the ephemera of our culture, which includes macaroni art done by 6th graders, to what extent do I want to share that? Right? As a cultural historian, it might be really nice to know that in the mid-70s, we shifted from macaroni art to, say, resistors and transistors art, right? And yet that might be unavailable. So, or let me put it in a concrete form. Suppose that you've got a kid, 20 years ago, 20 years from now, comes back and says, you know, I want to see my macaroni art from 20 years. A, will you still have it? And B, can you release it to him? And C, how?
And D, did his parent take a picture of it and post it on Facebook and say,
correct,
look at my kid's awesome macaroni art, and
right.
it's there. I still think that there is a way in which we are accumulating digital clutter, right? So when a server with 10 megabytes was an expensive proposition, right, we were really thoughtful about making sure we cleared out the graduating classes data. Right? When we have, you know, RAID systems and, you know, in the terabytes, suddenly we're less careful. So whether it will exist, I think the odds of its existing go up. I think the issue, again, is the searching. But I don't have the answer for you of how do we search it.
I think I know how to do that. But the, the digital clutter question is a real problem. So Howard, you've got this interesting thing that you're trying to document, say, with the Move On movement. And how do you separate clutter from signal from noise? Stuff that you want to preserve and actually you want to analyze versus capture everything.
Well, okay. So first of all, one person's clutter is another person's dissertation, right? I mean, we know that. So I'm a little bit hesitant about. I'm certainly hesitant about removing everything that I think is clutter.
So you would say there is no clutter?
No. I'm just saying. I'm saying I'm hesitant about it, and I would never want to go all the way in terms of eliminating clutter. Okay. Noise is good. Having some noise in the system is always good. But so with the Occupy movement, one of the ways we dealt with trying to, in some ways, remove clutter is the following kind of plan. Assuming that there are 1 million photographs related to Occupy out in the world, we set up a form that has people essentially vote on their 10 favorite things in each of 15 different areas. One area being this is material related to the internal workings of the organization. Another, confrontations with authority. Another, this, that, and the other thing. Let them vote, aggregate all of those, and you have a nice picture of at least what people at this point in time think are the important things. It's a way of crowdsourcing, but in a more controlled way.
So George, let me ask you a version of that question, which is, if you can't keep it all, you've already pointed this out, you can't keep it all, looking forward now, what do you want to see in the library? What kind of stuff do you want to collect that you're not now collecting? I'm thinking about what your next 10-year acquisition program is, or 100-year
Well, I
acquisition.
think that clearly is going to be the digital works, digital materials, and I think it's going to be a real challenge for the library to make a full transition in that area for the researchers. I mean, there are other places. I think it's called Biblioteca. Is that the area out in California or someplace the guy started with the it's all computers in the library. So, I mean, I think that you're going to probably see change that will actually transition the library into a more digital environment, more so than what it is today. I think we're doing great things digitally, but I think you're going to see even more as perhaps the focus changes. And I think the challenge that we face is that a lot of our initiatives are guided by the Congress. So, I mean, our funding comes from that, and it's what they think we should be doing to some part that they need to fund. that will allow us to do that. So I think it will have to come not just from the library, but from the people, that things that they want to see.
And things that they think are valuable.
Library. But to add on to what other people's been saying about archiving, I think it's also incumbent upon educators in certain areas to teach personal digital archiving, to be responsible for their own materials. Because as Barbara said, she knows the machines to go to that can read or save or whatever. The average person doesn't. Even some of the digital natives don't. They don't have a clear understanding of what it is to preserve digitally their photographs, some of their other materials, the picture of the macaroni art, whatever. So I think we have a responsibility there, and we've taken that on, and we are teaching personal digital archiving.
So what I hear you say is George Coulbourne is in favor of PDA, personal digital archiving.
Yes. I mean, I don't think we can always hold it to a corporation or a museum to be responsible for archiving all the cultural history of this country. I think it's incumbent upon the citizens to take on that responsibility, just like the citizens that were back during the Revolutionary War that took on responsibility to document and to hold and to keep these materials. So it cannot just be an organization. It is just not one person's responsibility or to archive and hold all this. I think it's a major challenge for the nation.
Right. Now, before we do that, let me see if we've got either questions. I want to turn it open to the audience here and to the grander audience out there in the rest of the universe, because that's where we're drawing from. So do we have any local questions from people? We have both Ira and Allison with microphones. Or do we have any questions that have come in through social media? Tanya, do you have one?
We have one question from social media, and before I read it, I would just like to encourage you. Charlie's in the back with index cards, so if you want to write a question down and pass it to the front, wave to Charlie, and she will come to you with an index card. Good.
Okay.
Well, if you don't,
start writing.
You know where to. So the question, we have a question from John on Twitter about archiving. And it's a trick question. What's going to stay the same and what's going to change? I think we've talked a lot about what's going to change, maybe a little bit about what's going to stay the same.
What's going to stay the same, what's going to change? Panel, anybody have an opinion about this?
Well, I think one of the things that's going to continually change is the operating systems and the core underlying code that drives our digital universe. And that's our biggest problem, is that as those underlying systems change, the content that's being created becomes outdated. And that's an ongoing challenge. Talking about personal digital archiving, you have to understand that if you want material to be available to you 20 years from now, every 5 years you're going to have to find a way to migrate it to a new platform.
And what's going to stay the same is that our cultural institutions are the ones who are really going to be able to do that, because the individual is not going to do that every 5 years and go through that kind of migration. But the responsibility of the cultural institutions is, if anything, going to be greater, not lesser.
That's a good sign for a lot of you guys in the States. Brendan, you're next.
I think the journalism is going to change also, because the process that we go through when we decide we're going to tell a story about this, the sourcing that we use will change. It's already changing. We use a product from American Public Media that's called the Public Insight Network, which is just a way of, a lot of media outlets use this. We have a topic we're interested in, and you send out to a pre-existing network that sends you that stuff. When we're talking about people sharing, I think that to some extent, from a media perspective, I was going to say that, we're talking about crowdsourcing. My experience working for a local show is that the problem of crowdsourcing, it's not preparing for the flood. The problem is that you don't get enough of this kind of stuff you're actually asking for.
Is it a quality problem or an off-topic problem?
Both, and it's a quantity problem, because if you're a local radio show, at any given moment there's 75,000 people listening to the Kojo show. That's a lot of people, but the people who have from that subset then have something substantive that they can give us that we want on any given topic. Sometimes the problem is that we ask for something and we don't get as much in as we want. Maybe we're asking the wrong questions. But the other thing I just wanted to flag is just the caution around all this stuff, is that when I've made ventures into using Maryland's very good geodata, or when I've been playing with the census data information for my own storytelling, I've been struck by the extent to which the existing data sets end up influencing the questions you ask.
Right.
And I think that that is both a good thing and a very bad thing. Like we can't lose sight of the fact that like we're asking really important abstract questions that maybe don't have a data-driven answer to them. And so I'm just curious if we start presenting this as some utopian future, we might be sort of, if we really did jump in whole hog into mining these archives, we might not actually be asking the kind of questions we should be.
So Don's got to be.
Well, I think one of the things that will stay the same if we don't affect a different trajectory for this is that the disenfranchised will be underrepresented in the digital archive. So so we're all talking about personal digital archiving. What about there are millions of people that don't have that opportunity, just like there were millions of people that in our current archives that didn't write letters, that aren't represented. And how is that? So that's one of the things about archiving that we need to keep in mind. That does it really represent the full spectrum of the world as it was lived?
Right. Barney, comment, and then we'll go back to the audience.
This follows up on WAMU's comment. I do think people, I certainly did this in school, choose something that's easy to research. And I think it's very likely. I didn't have Google, so I really had to work. That there will be not that the digital data will disappear, which is seemed our fear here, but that it will be by far the easiest to research, and that the pre-digital or the people who didn't make it into the digital won't be researched as easily. So are you a pre-digital person, which would be the first half of my life, or the second, and my kids would be all digital? Maybe they will have a longer historical record.
Well, one of the things that I find so interesting about this conversation is, as we mentioned earlier, the ease of access radically transforms, say, the way kids do primary source research. For example, you can now get into something like the Medici archive, which previously you would have had to go to Florence personally, put on the white gloves, and maybe get access. But now you can go through a web portal and get access to it. So let's turn our question over to the audience. Do you have a question, Mary?
I do. This is kind of in a little bit different angle at the archives. We used to have a cultural understanding of where to go to find all these archives if we were researchers, particularly not high-level institutional researchers, but students or young researchers. How will we let people know what we have, what is available to them to access, and what's a private, organizational archive, and where it is and how they can get it?
Well, I would like to give another plug to the National Digital Stewardship Alliance, and we just recently had them over to National Geographic because we are very interested in becoming sort of a part of a larger organization that can both help us in our process of preserving, but also provide some kind of a connection between us and other groups. So I know as a librarian for years we've had directories, subject area directories of archives and libraries, several volumes long, and some of those directories have been digitized. The Research Center's directory I'm thinking of specifically, but I think what you're talking about is not the established archives, but the ones, the sort of the narrow subject areas that are sort of popping up. And that is a concern, but also a challenge. I think just because they're there I think the easy step really is to find them and to organize it. So how about you guys do that? You want to do that?
Yeah. And I think that's what, like Barbara said, that's why the alliance was formed, because once again, you cannot depend on one organization to answer all of these questions that are constantly blooming every day. And I think through alliances and collaborations and partnerships, that's how we're going to have an answer to some of these questions. So I say get involved. People need to get involved with these associations, with these groups. and make recommendations themselves. It should be an open group and free-flowing information, and I think that's how perhaps we'll come to some, answers.
And our last comment from Howard on this.
Archives, museums, and libraries for the last 10 years have been trying to make their resources more available through efforts like the Open Archive Initiative and others to make them more searchable and findable. So I think that's one part of the answer. The other part of the answer is that we all have, as any of us in cultural organizations or even organizations like Google, have a responsibility to teach people good searching.
Right.
Dan, for example, has a third of a million people taking his course in improving searching, doing a better job of searching. And the critical problem, I think, is that people think that what they get is everything, and that they need to be able to drill down deeper and have the skills to look further.
Thanks for the plug, Howard. That leaves 99.9% of the rest of the world to cover. Final quick comment, Brent?
Yeah, well, I was a young journalist. I work with young journalists, and one thing that strikes me as a common problem is this idea of I'm going to just try to find it on the web. I'm not going to pick up the phone and call someone like Barbara. And so I'm just wondering also, again, just like this false sense of security that you're like, oh, well, I didn't see it on this archive, so clearly it's not there. Like, even now, with all these digital tools, for my producers, the most important thing is picking up the phone and talking to someone. And if a guest or a potential guest won't talk to us, we won't get them on the air, in part because that's when you ask a question and you get some sort of serendipity and you figure out a new angle. So I don't know where, with all these tools, and we're talking about this, what role of an actual, maybe it's like that Amazon Kindle woman who you hit and she tells you what's going on. Maybe we need that for each of these archive tools.
That's excellent. Let's go to our audience question.
I want to go back to the macaroni question because I'm from the field of American Studies, Cultural Studies, where we study the everyday lives of people. And we would want the macaroni picture. And I was thinking about the Barry School today, that today, the day after Nelson Mandela has passed, they are talking about Nelson Mandela, and probably this afternoon kids are doing some sort of creative activity around that. And a graduate student may need to study what are the reactions of children to the major events of their time, so that those macaroni pictures would be priceless. And then immediately I went to, okay, so say there is a personal digital archive and a place for people to load that in the people's library, and pun intended. Human subjects issues immediately become a problem because Facebook doesn't have a human subjects problem, but we do. So is there, and I know I'm in the weeds here for a minute, but is there any thinking about that permission? Because I'm the mom who runs up to people who are about to take pictures of my kids saying, do you have a form for me? What happens at that level?
So we have that form in our contract so that we get around the picture thing that way. In terms of, it's a great question, and I'm not sure we've answered it. In terms of, the homework, the paper, there are two sides to the question, right? One is, does it last? Is it anywhere? And then two is, what are the rules around access? I don't have an answer to you on the second one. On the first one, I'm optimistic. I still think there's a certain percentage of parents who, had a shoebox with all the art projects, and there's a certain percentage that didn't. And in the same way, there's a certain percentage of projects today that get archived one way or the other, and a certain percentage that didn't. So on the first, I'm optimistic, and on the second, I think really it gets to what people are feeling private about, and my observation is societally, we seem to be getting pretty casual about that. So I think in 20 years, if a researcher wants to see what was written about, what kids wrote today, there's not going to be as much concern as there would be now, or would have been 20 years in the past if you said, hey, can we see all the papers that got handed in that day?
Yeah, the truth is about the personal subject issue is that it is a complete I can't use the correct term, but chaos out there. Every country has a different set of laws. In many countries, every state has a different set of laws. In some states, different cities have different sets of laws. The terms of corporate ownership versus personal ownership, the use for commercial exploitation versus the use for educational. There is no coherent strategy around what rights you have to protect your children, what rights those children will have 20 years from now if those images resurface. We've already seen Facebook and other companies putting out these privacy statements which basically say, anything you post on our site, we can do anything we want with, and there's nothing you can do about it. That's sort of one end of the spectrum. Now you're seeing Europe, many of the European countries putting in much, much stricter privacy laws. But even over there, it varies from country to country, and we've got multinational platforms. How do you determine what's the rules? And it is truly chaos right now.
And our laws are totally out of sync with common practice, with what people really do. Right. And this is kind of what Tim was saying, that in fact in 20 years from now, these things will be totally common, but there's a real disconnect now between the legal system and what people do and expect.
Yeah. I just wanted to, this is really a Google question. There's a lot of this privacy or anonymity is accidental right now. How common is your name? Can you be found on Google, or is your name Kojo Nambi and you can easily be found? What's happening with that? Should a parent name their kid something unusual so that they will live forever, or should we protect their privacy by naming them Joe?
Well, I always wish that my parents would have named me Daniel, D-A-N-3-I-E-L. That would have been distinctly unique, where the 3 would be silent. But they didn't, and so I have a very common name. But the truth is, I think going forward for search, research, archive purposes, this is going to be increasing sort of authority problem from a librarian's perspective. You're going to have not just one Mark Twain, you're going to have 10,000 Mark Twains, right? And so how do you discriminate? You're going to have to add additional metadata filtering. The Mark Twain that lived in the 19th century versus the Mark Twains that lived in, say, Palo Alto in the 2000s, right? So I think that it has to do with more refined sense of that and a more semantic-based search. So let me turn it back to the audience, but I implore you all, we're going to start shifting this point in the conversation towards what do we do about it? Okay, so write those 3x5 cards telling us what to do. Question, ma'am.
Hi.
You're on.
My name is Linda Aldori, and I direct a Center for Health Literacy on campus, and a lot of the stuff that we do has to deal with health information and health disparities. And my main question is, who is missing in this conversation? Who is not getting the information? And who are we not finding out about in the data? A couple nights ago, we were at a community meeting in zip code 20743, which is in Prince George's County. And they just recently won a health enterprise zone because of how disenfranchised they are as a zip code. They, in fact, do not have one single primary care physician in that entire zip code. And we're at a meeting with civic leaders and community leaders, and half of them don't have email addresses. We need the phone. They are desperate for information, but they don't have the access to the information that we're talking about. So then we say, well, we want to find out about the zip code so that we can better the health and the health communication. And yet we go to the state of Maryland, and there are no zip code level data that we can find to really understand what's going on with the health. So both ways there seems to be this gap, and yet everybody talks about how the digital divide no longer exists because of the low-income and minority populations having cell phones. But I would argue it still exists, and what do we do about it?
So let me ask the panel that question and give it the proviso, and what would you do about it? Barney.
Well, I'm actually involved in that one, so I want to answer. We do work with the health department on what data gets public, and it's almost all county-based, as you found. And it's really a question of concern about privacy and past practice, what was possible to do and what is done. And I think we over-err on the side of caution, but that's their job in part. And I do know that they are thinking about it, and zip code is they can be very arbitrary boundary zip codes, but it is the most likely way to get health data, because when you get some that you can aggregate, it usually comes in with just a zip code. You don't get the patient's address at all, and so we are getting there.
I guess my soundbite on this is to put public librarians in charge of the archives and the services.
Here, here, here.
Because public librarians have always focused on serving the underserved. That has been that's what we teach them in library school. That is part of what they are, and that attitude needs to percolate into the other fields, like people who actually amass and gather the data and people who make that available. But it still is there in terms of librarians helping people try to find what little there is to find. But if it's not there, they can't find it.
So Barbara, you agree with this?
Yeah, a little. No, I heartily agree with this, and I would add to that school libraries as well, school media centers becoming more involved in the transfer of knowledge to the families and to working with the families in the schools. I just got back from the California Library Association meeting, and there's a big push in California to get all the public libraries having the same access, the same pipeline to the internet that the universities have in California. And to me, that will just open up. I mean, it's not just, opening your library and putting a couple terminals in there, but really what we're looking for is equal access to data, information, video, big data sets, and that's really where that I think will come to eventually. As funding increases on the state level.
So Brendan, now you seem like you're perfectly positioned, because this is your job, is reaching many, many people. And for the cost, basically, radio's infinitely cheap, basically, right? So do you have any solution for this kind of problem? Any thoughts about how to reach the large, nominally disenfranchised population?
Well, I mean, I was just thinking also, I think it's Clay Johnson, is one of the guys we talked to about sort of like having accountable data, and he had something about how if it's not online, it doesn't exist. I mean, I think it is really interesting that to some extent these, especially if we start talking about, government 2.0 and having government accountability, it's a really, the people who are advocates of it wouldn't like to admit this, but it's a very elite passion thing. And in any region like we have in Washington, D.C., it's true. They're like the people who value that, they happen to have very good data sets associated with the neighborhoods they live in. Right. And the people who don't, I don't know. I mean, for me, it's like, I think if we talk about that zip code, the entire media has a blinder on Prince George's County. I mean, it's a structural problem.
Interesting.
So
Don, what do you think?
Okay, so the National Park Service, this is not our issue, but just as a citizen, it seems to me that you are describing a kind of a data disability or a data disadvantage, and so wouldn't the commons, the government, have to treat this as as the way we treat other disabilities? That is, the person is obviously very disadvantaged by their not having access to digital resources. And wouldn't it be the government's responsibility, as we're requiring citizens to interact more using these tools? It becomes a recognizable disability, and I think the government would have to address it.
Just to follow up about parks, we've been trying to work with the local Parks and Rec and are not really succeeding. So there is a Parks and Rec involvement in terms of safety, in terms of physical activity that we're also looking at in the county and the zip code.
Yeah, we now on that front, we do deal with that every day. And in the national parks, we're working very hard to make sure that we don't disenfranchise visitors by making the safety and all that orientation information that is critical to their experience, making it unavailable to them because they must have a cell phone or they must have a this. We understand that all citizens must have access to that information when they visit a park, a national park. I don't know about.
Let me get a comment from Paul, then Brendan, then we'll go to Ira.
The about between 10 and 15% of Americans live in digitally deficient neighborhoods and communities. So the community you're talking about, Prince George's County, is just part of a much bigger problem. And there's actually a group of people whose job it is to go out and report that. They're called journalists. The problem is they're not doing their job. And it has been part of the structural change that's happened in journalism over the last decade, in that those kinds of communities, there used to be a person who was assigned to cover that community, and their job would have been, wait a minute, why are there no doctors in this zip code? And they could have reported that. And so really the responsibility comes on to those journalists to go out into those communities to report what's happening in those communities, particularly when you've got an issue as vital as healthcare. And especially now with healthcare being the issue in the country right now, the digital delivery, okay, if you're in a community that doesn't have a good digital infrastructure and you have no primary care, how are you supposed to go on healthcare.gov to get new insurance? Right. So exactly. So that it's the role of the journalists, particularly the local journalists, particularly what they call hyper-local journalism. They're the people that really should be taking this on, and it's their responsibility to do it.
We do have journalism models right now. Like, I mean, in Washington we have Homicide Watch, which is this fascinating project that won a Knight Challenge Fellowship and other things, which is literally the media isn't covering homicides that happen, so these two developers set out to have a platform that documented every single homicide that happened. Or if we're talking about data,
and it embarrassed the hell out of the Washington Post because they didn't cover any black homicides.
Right. But on the same time, we also had another story from the Post, which was real shoe leather journalism, where the police force in Washington D.C. reports gunshots, reports crimes that have occurred, and they have these digital sensors that also record them. And this piece came out a couple weeks ago that it was orders of magnitude of 10, the number that were detected that they found out through a FOIA request, and the number that was being reported. So there actually was a data set that was lurking out there that just had to be found by a journalist. But the one final thing I was just going to say about this is that I think that journalists, our platform, what I get frustrated with is we find these really interesting projects and we try to give them a platform to talk about this, to sort of like a meta conversation about these advancements. But even for us, it's like we say, oh, well, go to our website and you can explore the tools yourself. And I find that the actual user interface for all these tools is really deficient in many cases.
So this brings up the sort of the bigger issue of, just because we archive it, we save all these data sets, doesn't mean that anybody actually understands it. Right. Ira, over.
Question. To some extent, the conversation's moved on from the issue I wanted to bring up. But you had talked about initiatives that have been undertaken to sort of assign different organizations responsibility for collecting different data sets. But as a user of data sets, one of the things that it strikes me is that there's so much duplication of effort. I mean, there's enormous duplication of data entry across the system. So I was wondering, have there been any initiatives to sort of address that issue where data sets could share information rather than people re-entering data constantly? And then, of course, to go along with that, you'd have to have some agreement on who owns the data. And just, are you aware of anything being addressing that issue?
Barney.
It's very common in my work. So I'm a coordinator of the state's GIS data, and we reproduce it multiple times, right? And sometimes we produce it multiple times, sometimes we don't produce it at all. We have committees, we put out emails, we try to have a definitive place to go get the data so that you don't need to re-geocode all the schools in Maryland. But people still do that, and these data sets become out of date over time. So I think a lot of people, myself included, get paid to try to solve that problem, and it's worth the government to try to, at least with internally, to do it. But we have a long way to go, and in fact, sometimes the new technology comes along and makes it everybody a publisher even faster than we clean up behind.
If you're talking about content more generally than data, the library community has certainly recognized this and felt that coordination is really critical for all of this. So you have, for example, the Internet Archive's book scanning project, where different libraries throughout the country each coordinate so that they're not scanning the same book. The National Digital Stewardship Alliance is really oriented towards having people who might have duplicative efforts speak to each other before they end up duplicating their effort. Libraries have recognized this, 40, 50 years ago when they started joint cataloging of books through the MARC format. I mean, you don't want people doing duplicative efforts particularly when you have scarce resources.
But an interesting variant on that thought is sometimes it's actually worthwhile going and resampling the GIS positions. So for example, in Oakland Airport near where I live, the runways just got new numbers. So as you know, the runways are on the axis of the compass, so 36 left is on the axis 36 degrees. They're now shifted because the magnetic fields in our area have shifted a little bit. So if you don't remeasure that stuff every so often, you will be perpetuating the errors of the past, right? And so it's actually, sometimes duplication is good because it's efficient. Sometimes it's worth resampling. Do we have any other question? There's a question here. Over here.
Well, I'm sorry, can I say one thing
on
that?
Please.
Wouldn't there also be a quality check issue, right? So it's
Yes.
the crowdsourced model, whereas one is the expert who measures it once and you're done. Alternatively, do you want 10 measurements because you need to average them out?
Right. So I think there's also a lot of a theme we've seen multiple times here is you shouldn't just accept the first answer you find through a web search as the canonical correct answer. Don't do that, right? So in my classes, I always tell people do just one more search, find another source, right? And this is sort of what librarians have been saying since the dawn of time. You know, don't accept the first answer if you find it on the web or in the newspaper or in a book, right? Check your sources to get a different perspective. So this is still true. Yes, ma'am.
I'm Michelle Amprekos. I'm with the School of Architecture, Preservation, and Planning, and I teach students in both architecture and historic preservation. I was really struck by something you said, Brendan, about young journalists being unwilling to pick up the phone and make phone calls. So I'm a pre-digital person thrust into the digital age as an architect. And my 17-year-old stepdaughter has been my informant to the earlier generation. And she says some really very interesting things. I mean, she says that she's personally concerned that her friends are increasingly uncomfortable socially and making kind of human connections. And so I'm wondering if in the second part of the discussion we can also talk a little bit about the kind of human aspect, the human implications of this plethora of information we're talking about. What I find among my own graduate students is that some, not all, but some are increasingly uncomfortable talking to people. They're uncomfortable leaving their computer because so much is available online. And also, to some extent, feeling like the information they get from people in neighborhoods and communities isn't as valid as stuff that's found online. So I think that this is a really important kind of ethical, social, human issue we need to talk about.
I want to keep our conversation in the context of the theme for today. How do we take her concerns and thinking going forward again, what can we do about it? How can we improve our archives with respect to the humanity of the value of the data? Any thoughts?
I think this goes, I was going to make a comment that you sort of made, which was there's always a role for the connection piece, right? Whether that's the curators and the teachers, right? The fact that searching seems easy doesn't mean that we're all good at it. And so I think the personal piece is really about the fact that learning still ultimately is a social act, and using these is a learning process, using these tools, accessing the archives.
That's right.
I also think that much of our content in our collections is oral histories, is people talking, and I think that certainly addresses part of the problem here. If people are seeing more highlighted resources that are actually humans rather than actual data, that helps. But I also think as an educator, I think that this is this needs to be part of the critique of online courses and data-driven courses and things like that, as many people are really trying or many administrators are trying to force us into that kind of model of education, which really only exacerbates that problem.
I mean, I guess it's also the interesting thing is that if you look at, my show is about conversation. The best answers come from questions that leave open-ended paths for people to follow, the serendipity and unexpectedness. And I feel like that's a much more difficult algorithm to write than asking for a discrete answer for something. So, I feel like that's sort of like a disciplinary disjoint. Like people talk a lot about being interdisciplinary and all these other things. I feel like there's actually something kind of structural that's going on with that, and maybe that's part of the difference where the human being element of this has to be remembered.
But I think your point is you've observed a phenomenon which is cultural and generational, and that it appears to us that they're not engaging effectively in social interaction. It does not appear that way to them. When they're on that laptop, they feel like they're socially engaging with their friends. They're just not talking to them. And they may be sitting right next to them, but I'm talking to you here. Absolutely. And to them, that's a social engagement that's perfectly norm. The challenge for us is how do we archive that? How do we get that communication going forward into the future? How do we know what it is they're talking about? You know, in the 60s when you were down holding signs and marching against war, you knew what everybody was talking about. There was lots of documentation around those conversations. And now I think as it becomes increasingly digital and increasingly deliberately perishable, if you look at Snapchat, the whole technology was designed so I send her a picture and it disappears in 15 seconds. You know, so
but does it really disappear?
Yeah, and I think like Twitter
somebody has it.
Twitter is really the diary of this age.
Right. But how is this though? Because if I look at my optimal interaction with a guest I don't know, I'll send them an email to send them a signal that I'm interested in them. Right. And then I don't want to have a conversation with them over email. I want to talk to them on the phone. So as soon as they respond back, say, give me your phone number and I call. I don't know how you're going to archive that because like the substance of what happened was a phone call, and that's sort of by definition to be able to sort of make sure that I'm not getting stuck in just my own.
So I find this really interesting because one of the things I hear from you guys is the conversations we're having now are multi-channel. It's Twitter plus Snapchat plus instant messaging plus email plus a real phone call maybe or a video conference, or we now have many more different modes of communication. And I think Paul's a little right here where you may feel engaged socially with your peers if you're a teenager in a different way than we did. You probably sat on the phone and drove your parents crazy sitting in the hallway tying up the only landline. What a quaint notion. Right? But now you're right. We have these polyvalent sort of communication channels, and I don't know how to capture them. Yeah. Right. That's right. I understand. So we have, last question from the audience. And then we'll go into the final blitz round.
Well, hopefully the easy part is that while I was waiting to ask the questions, a lot of you started to answer it. So I'll pose it again for anyone who wants to catch up. But there was a follow-up to those questions, which are, what do some of you see as the new roles for information, archive, research professionals, the people who work with the community? And since you started that, I'll also do, and where really should they be now getting their training for these new roles, and where do you see maybe failure in training that we need to work out for the future?
Okay. Quick responses. Any thoughts, Howard?
Well, I mean, clearly one of the roles that we have to be more involved in is outreach and trying to get the average person to be more responsible about how they not just search, but how they save their own material. So the kind of outreach, I talked about this a bunch yesterday, and getting people to geocode their images before they upload them and get them to upload them to Internet Archive or places like that, and to have the date and time stamp on them, things like that. So certainly the outreach and the guidelines for people, I think that's a really critical piece of what we need.
It's an important skill set to have, absolutely. Barbara, do you have a job?
Excuse me?
Do you have a job for this guy?
I do.
I was asking about the future of information professionals.
I would say, having observed information professionals coming out of library school and iSchools and other schools over the past 10 years, is that there's a lot of really terrific technical ideas coming out, and those we have in have great ideas, but it's really more the listening skills. It's really more understanding the context of whatever group, or whether it's a community or a corporation that you're working with, to understand what their needs and priorities are before the solutions are given. And so it's politics, and it's also just listening.
George.
Yeah, that's it. Building on the residency that we just launched and the others that we've had, we see the problem of the disconnects between actually being able to work with one another, to understand the politics of working. So with this residency, we've built it out where they're embedded in a workplace, and they are counted as part of the staff as they go through. And Howard just presented at the first an enrichment series, which is going to cover everything from digital expertise or technology, changes in technology, but also actually day-to-day operations within an organization, and to address that you don't do everything by email, that you get up and you talk to people and you network with people. So I think there needs to be a change in the way we do residencies. We get residents from other schools, and they come in, and it's no requirement. It's very little requirement, I should say. So what we're trying to do is to set a template to say that a residency in digital technology or any background needs to encompass the real life work experience of what you're going to have, and it needs to be monitored closely. So the change in education and the way they come out, and they're prepared by theory, but they're not prepared by practice.
So as the moderator, it's my prerogative to ask the last question. Let me frame it this way. We've all been meeting here for a week. Allison and I are about to fall over in their shoes because they're so tired. But this has been an enormous amount of sharing of ideas, and we've had this interesting conversation today. What have you picked up from the conversations this week or today or in our coffees or whatever that you would want to take back? What have you learned? What have you picked up that's going to change the way your work or change the way you plan in the future? Any thoughts about that?
I'll start by saying that we have a digital literacy outreach that we try to do as part of our educational efforts, and I think to answer your question as well about information technology people in the future, I think understanding that digital literacy has to be part of the technology solution. We have to teach people, whether it's how to archive your photos properly with geotagged information, or whether it's how to maintain content that you want to keep for your family, or if it's how to get that content that you want archived in an institution, is that we have to embrace digital literacy as part of our social responsibility, and that we have to figure out how do we incorporate that so underserved communities are reached, that the new generation is reached, and that an older generation who are technologically antiquated are brought up to speed so they can fully participate.
Other thoughts, Barbara?
We are not alone. That's probably the broadest thought I have right now, is that we all have very similar issues, similar needs, and hey, we can find the solutions together. Much better than going it alone.
And I think that's the key word, together, collaboration, and I think that working together and not being redundant in your efforts, especially at a time of limited resources, is critical, and to go back and look at how people can communicate better with each other among the professions so that the redundancy is reduced and that your resources are applied towards common goals, whatever those priorities may be between the partners.
Great. Brendan, are you going to do 3D printing now?
We are going to have no. Part with the hat that we have on in terms of telling stories about really interesting work that's going on. I mean, actually, this is sort of a sidestep, but what really resonated from our Wednesday show was A, kids like 3D printers a lot, but B, that we have to, that the importance of connecting all these different archives and preserved materials to really compelling stories. I mean, ultimately, I think the only way that you're going to have a constituency that sees this as being really important is if you have really good case studies that prove why it's important. So when you hear somebody talk about, you know, satellites of pyramids and tells you about why that's there, and it's completely, you know, sort of intriguing to you, I think that that sort of drives home a lot of the themes that abstract conversations don't.
Very good, very good. So I got to put in a plug here for the library. The library, McKeldin Library we're at, has a 3D printer. So you can do it, and lots of libraries around the country are now installing 3D printers for exactly, thank you for generating that interest in that radio audience. Don, what would you say?
Well, our problem in the National Park Service is a little different from some others in that, you know, we don't know what is going to be so important that it will be added to our system and that we'll be the stewards of in the future. Well, what we have gotten out of this conversation all week is that obviously we have to pay attention to how these archives are being built and how are we going to interface when it comes our time to tell the story of the significant event and aggregate that information into something that people can experience authentically. What's authentic experience of digital information going to be? And how are we going to design the interface so that the experience in place feels authentic? And I think that's a challenge, and we'll be thinking about that as we move forward.
Tim, what have you picked up?
So one of the quotes on the first day, I think it was Amy, said was the idea that they're really focused on having kids not learn history but do history. And I think this distinction between learning and doing is somewhat artificial, right? Because to say that you know, an elementary school student can only be in a learning place, or a professor doing research is only in a doing research place, is an oversimplification. So I think, to me, what's reinforced here is the importance of empowering kids to really do and not just be pigeonholed as learners. And I think that the technologies you know, that enable them to really make movies and things like that, and the access to the raw materials, and the shifts in educational models, project-based learning, really do empower that. So that's kind of my takeaway for the week.
Very good, very good. Barney, what would you say?
I was just really impressed by the panels all week. I went to some and watched the others, and I just left me very optimistic about this whole area, that there's more information, and sure, we're going to lose some of it, but we're going to keep a lot more than we used to. You know, I think the caveman art was only surprised. Yeah, somebody drew on the beach and we lost that one, right? But the one in the cave we got, and there's going to be more caves out there. And I'm going to be affected, I think, more as a dad, just trying to get my kids excited about all these possibilities that they have to work with this data.
You know, it reminds me that one of the things I've seen recently in the category of ephemeral art is GPS art. You know about this, where people will put a GPS tracker on their bike or their car, then drive in the shape of a turkey for Thanksgiving through the streets of San Francisco or whatever. So that's a different kind of use of GIS data.
Or the people who wait around for the Google Earth cameras to, you know, something and hope that they're going to get caught on a camera.
A whole new kind of performance art. What would you say, Howard?
Well, you said, Dan, you said that you weren't going to go in line and leave it so that I don't have anything to say at the end. And now I'm the last
I did it for
person.
a good reason.
So you learned not to trust them.
So I guess, you know, I mean, I'll be a little bit redundant and say that, you know, the most critical thing has been to have everyone out here talking. And talking about trying to solve common problems in common ways. And that, I think that's the key thing. The other thing is I should show off my 3D printed bracelet, which I had with me before I even knew that there was a 3D printer discussion.
So.
Very good. So that's going to wrap up our panel for right now. Let me thank our panelists very much. Appreciate it. And I'm going to turn it back to Allison and Ira.
And of course, we have to thank Dan Russell, everyone. Thank you so much, Dan. Dan has been a leader in the Future of Information before there was a Future of Information Alliance, and we are thankful for him helping lead us through the last few years. And so but there are other people besides Dan here that we do have to thank. And we just want to say thank you to Tanya Lockhart, our FIA coordinator, Tanya. Ann Rose, who is the guru of all FIA website things. You're on that live stream. Yay, Ann. We have Charlie Luetes, who has been coordinating things behind the scenes and logistics. Thank you. Lisa Press from the UMD Convention and Visitor Services, wherever she is. Ah, there she is. Okay. Jeff Snyder, Veronica Lewis, Maria Thomas from the Office of the Vice President for Research. Yay! Oh, those people are they're amazing. Okay. Oh, Beth Foss, who is collecting all of this and putting it in her dissertation, I'm sure, but also for all of us to work on in the future. A special thanks to Jane Gould, who not only puts up with me, but has been our designer of all of our opening slides and the video you saw this morning, and that we'll be putting up on the website. And there are other people here besides Preston, who is our greatest guru here of technology. Thank you. Yes, thank you, Preston. All right. And the gang with Preston, and I don't know your names, but anyway, thank you. Okay. All right.
Raise your hands.
They're responsible for our sound today. So a couple things, a few more shout-outs, a little bit of a plug, and then we'll go out with a bit of a bang. So first we want to thank again the Robert W. Deutsch Foundation, who've been helping us tremendously with funding for programs like this, but also they have allowed us to fund a seed grant program for students that promotes interdisciplinary work by teams of students to address some of exactly these kinds of challenges. On Monday in this space at 10 a.m., 10 of these teams will compete to be the 4 winners, and the 4 winning teams will get $25,000 in stipends and expense money to carry out projects together with faculty mentors. And I think actually every partner here is represented in some wish list of these teams. So, and we had 4 wonderful teams last year, did great projects. You can see them on our website, fia.umd.edu. There are video stories about each of them and their projects. Our next step is to aggregate what we've learned this week. We have the videos, we got them on tape. We have you on tape. And so we are going to mount an effort on our website to aggregate this with a document with some multimedia materials. If you signed up for today's event, or if you signed up for any of our events, you will get an email from us asking you to participate in this, and we'll put something up on our website. And so this effort to sort of figure out what to do about the future of the past continues, so stay tuned. And then the very last thing. So we actually just heard about this notion of having kids learn history by doing history, and we're going to go out and show you one of the things that we saw in Baltimore at Fort McHenry in the program on Monday, which is quite a novel way of having kids learn history by doing history. It's a rap video, and but the kids wrote the material. They used multimedia to make the video. They acted in it. They performed in it, and so this is a pretty interesting example of using new things to do old things.
Yes, and on the live stream, we will point to this video so that you can hear it. Otherwise, you're going to have to hear Ira and I rap it, and that's not going to be good. Okay, here we go to the video.
was the only family I got. Well, and love is difficult. We the 54 president, all the black soldiers, do what we got to do, our race ourselves, so I walk out, my head and my own love, that seems close. We the 54 president, all black soldiers, do what we got to do, our race ourselves, so I walk out, my head and my own love, that seems close. Proud black man with the 54 president, front line fighting for my rights against the president. Was a slave, but time to be a veteran. And if I die alone, at least I get to see my regiment. Trying to make it real, the shoes up my feet. I'm home, you trying to be free. Freedom at last, freedom at last. Trying to stand strong with the flags on his back.
They keep fighting, yeah, they keep fighting. Treated like dirt, wounded but never hurt. They stick together just to survive. However, we gon' die with pride and faith. Never let the hate destroy faith. Inspire the hope. So many lost, people unfold. I write the unwritten poems of the unknown.
We the 54 president, all black soldiers, do what we got to do, our race on our shoulders, so I walk around, my head on my own love, that seems close. We the 54 president, all black soldiers, do what we got to do, our race on our shoulders, so I walk around, my head on my own love, that seems close. 54 president, aiming the muskets, over his Confederates, dude told me to join these famous Confederates, and they got me sitting here, shoveling, to get to the point they named Wagner, closer and closer, moving forward, not backwards, we can free us, so no more slave masters, I'ma stand tall in the face of disaster.
Now I lay my head down to sleep, and if I know that tomorrow has my soul to keep, he's just a black man fighting for equality, and what's he really gotta lose without a family? Shoes on his feet torn, hands blistered and rough, doing it for a paper man, nothing's enough, work harder than the white man is still getting less, only way he's going home is a bullet to the chest.
We the 54 president, all black soldiers, do what we got to do, our race on our shoulders, so I walk around, my head on my own love, that seems close. We the 54 president, all black soldiers, do what we got to do, our race on our shoulders, so I walk around, my head on my own love, that seems close. Battle to the death, won't stop, never rest. If I do, hope I die with 54 on my chest. Battle to the death, won't stop, never rest. If I do, hope I die with 54 on my chest. Sergeant William H. Cotty, I escaped from slavery, wanted to medal of honor for actions of bravery, actions that made me and forget my family. Listen in the 54, I got a date with destiny. My weaponry, Springfield musket, mission, assault for Wagner. In God we trust in freedom. We love it under enemy fire. Got sharp two times, but I won't be tired, 'cause I am inspired. And with this desire, I pick up my flag, my regiment and irons, 'cause the old flag never touched the ground, boys. Sacrifice made so you can make the right choice. We the 54 president, all black soldiers, do what we got to do, our race on our shoulders, so I walk around, my head on my own love, that seems close. We the 54 president, all black soldiers, do what we got to do, our race on our shoulders, so I walk around, my head on my own love, that seems close.
So there you have one take on the future of the past, and this was a project that was made possible by the National Park Service. So thank you all for coming, and to be continued.